Hello and welcome to the podcast. It's Bash the Beeb week again. Leading the charge is the Daily Telegraph, which quotes a former BBC Editorial Standards Committee advisor as claiming that the BBC Panorama programme had doctored a speech by Donald Trump which made it appear he had incited the Capitol Hill riots. It's worth noting that the House of Representatives impeached Trump for incitement of insurrection and that the Senate voted 57-43 in favour of conviction. 7 Republicans voted with the majority. The Telegraph followed this up with allegations about the corporation's Arabic service and once more gave supporters of Israel, like Danny Cohn and Stephen Pollard, the opportunity to claim the BBC was hopelessly biased in favour of Hamas. The Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, then called for BBC heads to roll, as did former leader and Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and there have been wider calls for Director General Tim Davie to resign. The BBC, meanwhile, remained silent. I think it is absurd to generalise from the occasional mistake that the BBC as a whole is hopelessly biased, and I do not believe the DG should resign, though he does need a deputy who can go out and take the flak and defend the corporation. The BBC has no shortage of enemies here at home, but this week I want to explore the wider and arguably more serious threats to the corporation's journalism abroad. My guest is Pat Younge, formerly the BBC's Chief Creative Officer, who's run a cable station in the United States and who was until recently a non-executive board member of ITV. He heads up an organisation called the British Broadcasting Challenge and has just sent the Culture Secretary, Lisa Nandy, a series of proposals to safeguard the future of a truly independent public service broadcaster. We talked on Tuesday morning this week. Pat Younge, welcome to the podcast. Who are you? Not Pat Younge, but what is the British Broadcasting Challenge?
The British Broadcasting Challenge is in that fine British tradition of a bunch of do-gooders who care about public service broadcasting. That's our big goal. The membership is Professor Stephen Barnett and Professor Jean Seaton from the University of Westminster, Chris Waiting, who runs an academic magazine called The Conversation, Rosalind Hughes, who's a former BBC producer, and Lindsay Mackey, who is involved in the environmental movement and a former journalist, and myself. And our goal is to elevate the discourse around public service broadcasting, not just the BBC, but Channel 4 and on the commercial broadcasters. We think it's a public good. We think we have an ecosystem that benefits the UK, both economically and socially, and we want to fight to keep it protected.
Well, you've sent this letter to the Culture Secretary, which is a manifesto, which is called Renewing the BBC, a New Charter for Britain and the World. Obviously, you've done it now because we're into charter renewal. Well, we should be, and we should be into the discussion, but we've been promised a green paper for donkey's years, virtually it seems. Did you get a reply from the Secretary of State? And do you know when this debate is going to really start in Parliament?
We did get a reply. It was a holding reply thanking us for the document and telling us that it will be considered in the context of the green paper. Didn't tell us when it will be published, but we also publish now because there are changes afoot within the broader broadcasting and communications ecosystem that we think are really important. If you look at the world in which we live in today, the world's richest man, Elon Musk, owns X, which is one of the biggest communication platforms in the world. I mean, and just last week, he said that a civil war was inevitable in Britain in the wake of the attack on the train in Huntingdon.
Yeah, he's also championed Tommy Robinson, hasn't he? Indeed, financed Tommy Robinson.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. Financed him. The world's second richest man, a guy called Larry Ellison, he owns Skydance Paramount. He's also going to be on the board of TikTok USA, along with Rupert Murdoch, and his company Oracle are going to be the data handlers for TikTok USA, which is another now major discovery platform. World's third richest man, Mark Zuckerberg, owns or controls Meta, which delivers WhatsApp, Instagram and Facebook. Again, major social platforms. The world's fourth richest man, Jeff Bezos, owns and controls Amazon Web Services, on which I think BBC iPlayer sits, also the Washington Post and Amazon Prime. And the world's fifth and sixth richest men own YouTube and Google. So we're seeing this consolidation of broadcasting platforms, modern broadcasting platforms, media platforms, in the hands of private individuals. And what we're seeing stateside is a consolidation of those assets with more traditional broadcasting assets. So Larry Ellison has just bought Skydance Paramount, which gives him now control of CBS News. Now, to enable that deal, he settled a rather frivolous lawsuit that Trump brought against 60 Minutes, claiming that Kamala Harris had been improperly edited. And he now wants to buy Warner Brothers, which means he'd then have control of CNN.
And this matters presumably because journalists or broadcasting is just one of the many things they have in their large companies, and the important thing for them is to stay in with whichever president is in the White House. And a secondary question is, of course, whether or not they keep an independent journalist operation going on, which is critical of that very president.
Well, absolutely.
We've moved on from a time when broadcasters are owned by people who only do that.
Yeah, ABC settled with Trump over the Stephanopoulos interview. Everybody said ABC would have won their case in court. CBS settled with Trump over 60 Minutes. Trump, in an interview with 60 Minutes this week, said how happy he was that this woman, Barry Weiss, had been brought in as editor-in-chief of CBS, and he was now looking forward to more favourable coverage. So that's not to malign the journalists at CBS. There are lots of good journalists in all these organisations, but we're now in the era where these people are held by private individuals who have other interests, and those interests are not necessarily in the public good.
It's a hostile world, but it's also quite hostile here. I mean, one of the most significant shareholders, if not the majority of shareholders, GB News, Sir Paul Marshall, gave a speech in which he talked in derogatory terms about the BBC, but basically wanted to get rid of it. And we've seen just this week Daily Telegraph attacking the BBC over its coverage of Trump and so on. It's a pretty hostile world internationally and nationally.
It is.
Do you think that in Parliament itself there are still enough people who understand the importance of public service broadcasting, or do we have to, in a way, start the process again of making the case for it before you talk specifically about the BBC?
I think they fail to understand the consolidation that's happening at the moment. Channel 5 is now wholly owned by Larry Ellison. Sky is owned by Comcast. So if you look at who are the ITV's biggest shareholders, John Malone, who sits on the board of Warner Brothers, which could in turn be bought by Paramount Skydance. So we're in a period of unprecedented consolidation, not just of broadcasters, but of these new social media platforms that all of our research say people, especially young people, get their news from.
And then there's this additional problem with streaming, which is developing, obviously, dramatically, is that how can you ensure that if you go to a streamer, you will be made aware of a range of public service programming? I mean, taking Amazon, for example, if I order a crime novel on Amazon, they'll inundate me with, 10 more crime novels I should buy. What they won't tell me is a whole range of other things that might be there. So as we move to streaming, it's presumably absolutely crucial that whichever platform, ITV or BBC or whatever gives prominence to public service broadcasters and makes sure that if you're going there, what's available. Do you think that's secure? That question of prominence is secure?
The government says that they accept the arguments on prominence, as do Ofcom, but we've yet to see it happen in practice. I've got a Samsung TV. If I turn on my TV, the front page is Samsung, and then it is the BBC, amongst others. So how we achieve prominence, both in technology terms and also on the streaming platforms themselves, is an issue. I also think for the BBC, ITV Channel 4, trust is an issue. Trusted content is an issue. There's no point in having public service values and public service news organisations if people don't trust the content that they're seeing. So it's not all about the tech bros. There is work that we need to do here to make sure, especially in an age where information is the new battleground, people need to know that they can trust the material that they get, especially from the BBC and Channel 4, but also from ITV and Sky.
So there's an interest in competitors, ruthless competitors, in undermining trust.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's not new. Rupert Murdoch used to do it through The Sun and others. But now they are all converging into the same space. And so that battle is becoming, and the prize for victory is also more significant. So the reason we publish this document now is that we need to reframe the argument, especially around the BBC. The BBC is like the sun around which our entire broadcasting universe revolves. So we need to get the BBC right if everything else is going to be right.
Well, you've headlined your proposals, renewing the BBC, a new charter for Britain and the world, and you say, we believe the BBC must emerge from charter review as a renewed force, able to speak with and to the nation and the world, and ask as a bulwark of democratic resilience in a volatile and dangerous world. And your first proposal is that there should be a BBC funded fairly and at scale. Now, that's a bit fuzzy, isn't it? I mean, what's fair and what's at scale?
Yeah, well, fair, for example, the BBC's been cut by over 30% in real terms in the last 10 to 15 years. We would argue that cut needs to be restored because the consequence
But it's not going to be restored. Look, there isn't a cat and hell, Pat. Realistically, Pat, there isn't a cat and hell's chance.
But that doesn't mean you don't argue that it should be restored. I mean, yeah, we are very clear that it won't be the British Broadcasting Challenge or our fellow travellers who are going to set the licence fee. But we need to make the case for what we believe that licence fee should be. And who knows, just like no one thought Trump was ever going to win his first or second election, we may win on this one. So we believe the licence fee cut should be restored because we need a BBC at scale. We think the principles of the licence fee ideally should be more progressive.
What, by that means that the richer should pay more than the poor?
Certainly the poor shouldn't be disadvantaged in the way in which they are. It's ridiculous that I, on my income, pay the same as somebody on income support. Now, whether you do that through the benefit system or whether you do that through another mechanism, that's for people with far more money than us to work out. We just think ideally it should be more progressive. And what you call it and how you levy it, as long as the money goes directly to the BBC, we're totally open on that. So we're not going to pretend that we solved the licence fee question. We just give the principles and the ambition in terms of funding, because people complain about cuts to local radio. You know, I'd be really interested to see how, for example, the Huntingdon train incident was covered, given what's happened in local radio. Where were the journalists? How would it have been covered previously? How would it have been? Local radio, to me, has been one of those areas that has lost out in the squeeze.
And in the local radio is always within the BBC had a big battle to be heard, to be absolutely honest. But
Indeed.
Anyway, that's a separate question.
Indeed.
That's a separate one. But you talk about independence and government and accountability, and you specifically say that the BBC should have a permanent charter establishing the BBC's right to exist in perpetuity with core principles protected from political interference. Now, some people would say, hold on a second, look, let's take accountability in the other way. Doesn't this leave the possibility of an arrogant BBC who just says, well, we've got a permanent charter?
No.
Okay, we're not going to be,
What the permanent charter says is there will be a BBC, the same way that we say there will be an NHS. The NHS has a permanent charter. We don't every 10 years say, shall we have an NHS or not? We have an NHS. So the question that the very continuation of the BBC is even a question for debate is one that we would draw a line under and say there should be a BBC. Now, and that BBC should be in perpetuity. What that BBC does should be subject to a 10-year operating agreement, which is negotiated with Parliament. And that's where you would negotiate what it does and how it does it. Governance is the third leg of that stool, because we think the current governance arrangements don't work. We have this so-called unitary board, which has a combination of political appointees or government appointees and senior executives. Richard Sharp, the former chairman, insisted on interviewing the head of news at that time, because he said if she was going to sit on his board, he wanted to have some input into the appointment. That's not.
And Richard Sharp was a friend of the Prime Minister at the time. Boris Johnson, indeed, had paid money in.
He wasn't actually a bad chairman, but the very principle that the chairman of the board, why do we get all this confusion over accountability? Well, if you've got political appointees and the management sat together taking decisions, it's very hard to work out who's accountable for what. So we say go back to a management board and a governance board.
And a governance board. So you split it again.
Yes.
Well, but on the question of that governance board, which is the ultimate authority for the BBC, you've argued for an independent body with responsibility for making appointments to a governing board with charter-specific criteria for regional representation and essential experience. So you want to take the appointment of whatever we call them, BBC governors or whatever, away from Parliament. But who's going to decide on who is the independent body? Surely the government will decide on that. And so it may distance the BBC a little further from government, but not that far, would it?
Well, I would hope that at the very least, the select committee would have input into who those members are, which is one step away from the executive. At the moment, when we talk about the government, we're really talking about the executive. At the very least, if the select committee had the final say, that would bring it to Parliament rather than the executive. So, we're not naive. There's always going to be political involvement. But at the moment, you only have to look at America and to see how Trump has just trampled over PBS, NPR. Imagine what a Farage's government would do with the current levers of power that we make available to the executive.
But you make it more difficult. But the BBC, with all the argument, is the BBC independent? In a sense, the BBC has always had independence under licence.
Yeah.
And you've got to be careful, what the licence says and who sets it.
Yes. So we would argue that the group of people who do the appointments and who make the case for the licence fee are independent of the executive. We've said that they should be approved by the select committee. And we give the BBC operational and editorial independence within a parliamentary framework.
But you're also wanting to see citizen assemblies to increase accountability and engage with the public.
Yeah.
Now, you were, of course, Chief Creative Officer of the BBC at one stage, and a lot of creatives would say, look, it can't be a democracy, when you're deciding on to make programmes. You want the best people, and give them a lot of freedom, and they come up with things that most of us wouldn't think of. So what does a citizen assembly offer?
I think citizens' assemblies, you probably remember the old regional councils that we used to have.
Yeah, in the BBC, yeah.
And, when you got called in front of a BBC regional council, that you had to go and you had to really perform and you had to show that you knew the region and you understood the issues. We've lost some of that connectivity between the audience and the corporation. Citizens' assemblies would be really interesting, for example, on the area of children's television. Has the BBC got the balance right? Citizens' assemblies would have been a quite interesting place for the BBC to make their case for the changes they've made to local broadcasting, for example, as opposed to it's come out from on top and here's the changes. We also had this bizarre situation, and, I chair Cardiff University, and I'm very glad that Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland have one governor each. England only has one too. That seems not to sort of make sense in the totality of the picture that we face. So that whole body, that whole board needs rethinking. And one of the problems with the current structure, because it is merged with the senior leadership board, is that you can't have too many seats on it. So England gets one seat. I think England is underrepresented.
Well, if I can move on, nobody's going to disagree with you when you say one of your main aims is to counter disinformation. And obviously that means sustained funding as well for the World Service. Which is crucial. How would you feel if the government said, or BBC argued, come on, in the end, the government should pay directly for the World Service? Because at the moment we have this situation where there are some, there used to be the case, but there are some grants, but now essentially the majority of money comes out of the BBC licence fee, and so the Director General essentially has to say, I'm going to make cuts on that which programming that the licence fee is people are able to watch and hear, in order that people in the rest of the world could gain access to some of our programmes. And he obviously feels a bit uneasy about that. Would you therefore look forward to a situation where the government directly funds the World Service, or again would that raise worrying questions to you about independence?
No, I think we should go back to the old system where the World Service was funded directly. I also think S4C should be funded directly and not top-sliced out of the BBC licence fee. When we talk about how do you restore a 30% cut, well, if you take away some of the obligations that the BBC's taken on, you can probably get there in pretty good time. So I do think the World Service should be directly funded. And likewise, I think S4C should be directly funded rather than being paid for from the licence fee.
Now, you make another pitch very much for universality, and particularly for making sure that the BBC News is in prominent positions in its broadcast schedules, strengthening domestic and international current affairs and also developing a news app and so on. And yet we've just heard from the BBC that it's, I think, written to Ofcom, asking to be able to reduce the amount of current affairs it shows in prime time, and specifically not to have any obligation, as far as I can see it, to show current affairs in prime time on BBC One. Now, certain people in the BBC would say, well, that's just recognising what's happening. Relatively few people watch the schedule through. Actually, rather large number do. Are you worried about that? Do you think it is still important to say you must have the news in prominent and current affairs in prominent positions on the major channels?
Yeah, I do think it's important. And I accept we're moving into an on-demand world and people seek out those things that they want to watch. But we have a universal BBC. We're arguing that everybody should pay for it, and that there's obligations that come with that. They are not Netflix. They are not Disney Plus. They are the BBC. And news is an important part of the BBC offer, and news should be prominent on all of its channels, both domestic and international. I mean, I think one of the challenges in some of the documentaries and the issue which have given the BBC the biggest headaches in recent years have been documentaries masquerading as current affairs. Current affairs is a different and distinct form of journalism, and it may not rate as well as a documentary, which is more filmic normally in nature, but current affairs is part of what the BBC is there to provide, and it should be on all of its channels, and yes, it should be in prime time on BBC One.
Well, I agree with you, obviously, because I'm tearing my hair, what little hair I have let out because the absence of context. I mean, news is terribly important, but of course, events dictate how much time in news you give to a particular thing. And I'm struck also by we're now in an era where, let's say Donald Trump, for example, can make an outrageous statement which is irresistible to news on day one. By day two, when you hope some analysis or verifiers got to work on it, he makes another outrageous statement, and news thinks, we've got to cover that because he's just made it, we can't miss the news, which means context, analysis, whoops, where is it? And so by flooding the zone, as of course some of his supporters call it, this is the way you can see people elsewhere in the world looking what's happening. That's the way to do it. Keep them on the move all the time.
And we find ourselves doing that. You, I'm sure, me.
Yeah.
What's he said now?
Yeah.
And then you go off down that wormhole.
Yeah.
So look. The schedule isn't what it used to be. The schedule used to be a means of delivering people from one program to another program to another program, and a lot more content is consumed on demand by some of us. But there's a substantial body of people who still watch the schedule, and the schedule is also an expression of value. If you want to take current affairs out of prime time, essentially saying we're going to take Panorama out of the 8 o'clock slot and stick it at 10:30. Well, that's not a public service. That's a public disservice.
So why have they done it? I get worried about that. I mean, I admire on the whole, the BBC Director General, Tim Davie. I think given an impossible job, he's done remarkably well. But asking for complete freedom, effectively, to take current affairs out of prime time on BBC One and to reduce it overall, I start to get bothered about that.
Yes, so do I.
Can I just a couple of things I want to do with you before the end of this discussion? I don't quite understand perhaps the final point you talk about values-led technology.
Yeah.
You said the BBC to be tasked with maintaining and expanding its research and development capabilities, so the digital transformation works in the public interest. Now, of course, in the past, when the BBC was virtually the sole broadcaster, you had massive engineering departments, and it developed its own products, but for the last 20, 30, 40 years, if essentially it's looked at and taken things off the shelf. I generalised desperately. Why do you think it's important now that the BBC maintains and expands its capabilities?
Well, the BBC has a real R&D history and pedigree, and at the moment, getting its services, its products, its content to people is now reliant on the technology of a whole bunch of other partners it doesn't control. It doesn't control the algorithm on the social media platforms. It has to argue for prominence on the technology platforms. And so the BBC needs to have its own technology wing that can help it make its case. It might be about developing a new algorithm. It might be about new forms of personal online safety in terms of how you protect children who are consuming BBC content from malign forces. But to concede the entire technology field to everybody else, I think will be a big mistake.
It's quite interesting, isn't it? It reflects a broader change in society where we used to believe, or relatively recently, globalization was here to stay and important. It didn't matter where you sourced things from. And then we've suddenly realized in food, in energy, in defense and other things, but hold on, it does matter. And what you're saying, what you're saying in a sense, if we don't control the way in which, the means by which we transmit or communicate these programs, we may end up not being able to communicate them at all because we've lost our control.
Yeah, we live in an age where AI technologies and whatever can create very convincing deep fakes, just copying other people's material. There's talk of, is there a BBC watermark that tells you at least where the content is sourced from? These are things which the technology teams need to engage with. And again, it's one of those areas where it's not public facing, so the reduction in investment isn't obvious, but the penalty does get paid further down the road.
It's another question of sovereignty, isn't it, in a way? A different sort of sovereignty, but the ability.
Well, the license fee used to be to broadcast it to your house, and that was the. Now we need new mechanisms, new ways of certainly making sure that the BBC's content gets to the people who want to use it and who are entitled to use it, and ideally gets in a way where they know that it's safe and unadulterated.
How much do you think you're crying in the wilderness here? Do you have because what we've been trying to do with our podcast is to raise some of these issues and so on in a very small way. But I find it quite difficult to find leading people in Parliament and elsewhere who are prepared to really engage or seem to be ready to engage in these issues or to be absolutely blunt, sometimes aware of them. I mean, you hope that the charter process is going to be an educative, you'll be able to raise these issues, and whether they accept your answers or not, they'll at least be discussed. Do you have confidence that will happen?
I remain confident. I'm an optimist. Lisa Nandy said in a speech to the RTS that this charter renewal was an opportunity to future-proof the BBC so it thrives, not just survives, and not just for the next decade, but for the next century. Well, that requires some big, brave decisions. It may require politicians to give up the tight control they have over some of the levers in order to develop levers which are more suited for the period we move into. I look at Trump and see what overweening executive power can do when you have someone who doesn't play by the gentleman's rules that we all seem to think that things should be governed by. And I do believe the BBC superpower in this age of consolidation is its universality and the idea that it's for us and by us. We own it. It's our BBC. So I do think that universal play is key to the BBC's future. Anything that reduces universality, whether that's tiered subscriptions or advertising funding, anything that reduces universality weakens the BBC. It's like kryptonite to the BBC. But they do have to answer some fundamental questions about independence, governance and funding.
And one final thing, which you don't mention, and the BBC doesn't mention much now, is actually what public service is outside of news and current affairs.
Yeah, no, we do say it's everything. When we talk about universality, we say it's entertainment, it's sport, it's news, it's current affairs, it's art, it's drama, it's children's, it's all of those things. It's nations and regions, it's employment. The BBC, you think about the BBC and its interventions. There's a sort of economic intervention. There's a social cohesion intervention. It's the place where we tell our stories to ourselves and each other, as well as increasingly in the space of news, there's also a trust and.
But you'll know that in the last Broadcasting Act passed in the last Parliament, it removed from public service broadcasters the specific responsibility to make programmes in areas such as religion, the arts, science and so on. It did mention children's. And equally, the Ofcom, the regulator, was released from the responsibility of measuring what public service broadcasters do in this area. So we don't know what we're missing, but except we think we're missing it. So again, doesn't there need to be, and I know you can say particularly to ITV, Channel 4 and others that are struggling for income, obviously, and to stay afloat in a profitable way, you can't regulate people who aren't making money, but don't you think we need to restate what public service is in these areas that we should be saying, for the future, we need to make our children understand the dangers of AI. We need to make them, realise and to be able to see what is false and what is true. But we also need to look at engineering and science and so on and say that public service broadcasters must have a view to doing these things somewhere in the schedules. At the moment, they've got freedom to drop it.
I actually agree with you. I mean, one, we would take Ofcom out of the content regulation of the BBC. But this is the sort of thing that we would expect to see in a new charter or operating agreement. And I think the BBC may have to carry slightly more of the load than you would expect ITV to. I think BBC and Channel 4, wholly publicly owned, may have to do a bit more of the lifting. But in an on-demand world where content is available via multiple platforms, that's probably less of a problem. But this is a chance to try and get it right for the future, because the speed at which the consolidation is happening on the other side of the pond, which does affect us, because I say, Skydance, Paramount, CBS, they own Channel 5. CBS is actually the BBC's news partner at the moment, so if there's any shift in CBS news values, what does that mean for the BBC? This idea that the BBC is hermetically sealed and is in its own world, that's for the birds. We have to look at these things in a much more sort of global and economic context.
Well, Pat Younge, thank you for helping us do precisely that, and good luck.
Thank you.
Our thanks to Pat Younge, and you can find out more about the British Broadcasting Challenge and their proposals in the link which is in the description of this programme. Now, if you'd like to support us, you can do so for less than the price of a cup of coffee a month. Just head to patreon.com/BeebWatch and sign up for £1.99 a month. You'll also receive my weekly blog in which I share some reflections on the week's interview. And that's all for this week. This podcast is presented by me, Roger Bolton, and it's produced by Kate Dixon, with sound by Dave Kitto, and special thanks to Quinn Genti. It's a Good Egg production. Until next time, goodbye.